So good morning, everyone. I think we're live. Also, good afternoon to China. We will be waiting another minute for you to read these instructions. And before we start, we have some other people join. So please make sure you have the translation settings in the way so you can understand us as you wish. A couple of housekeeping rules I want to stress in the beginning. So we will not be taking questions during the webinar, but please use the chat box to post your questions, post your ideas, whatever you want us to comment on, and we will then pick it up at the end in the Q&A session. Also, in case you have troubles with the translation setting or some technical issues, please post them into the chat box as well, so our team can address them if possible. Okay, I hope everybody has managed to set their settings straight. So I move on with the webinar. So again, welcome everyone, a warm welcome from Germany and Wiesbaden to this webinar from Palleos and Starodub. We'll be focusing today on unlocking the EU market. So we'll be looking at cost-effective strategies for regulatory and clinical success. In terms of our speakers, so we have Valentina Starodub, who is the CEO of Starodub. That's an EU regulatory agency and consultancy in the Netherlands. She has more than 25 years of experience in regulatory affairs in various positions and various companies. And she'll be focusing today on the regulatory aspects of the EU market. Then we have Paulina Schatrover. She is our Director of Budgets and Proposals with degrees in corporate and financial management. And she has more than 9 years of experience in the space, specifically with regards to budgets and proposals in clinical trials. And last and finally, myself, Philip Brad, I'm the Managing Director of Palleos Healthcare. We are a full-service CRO out of Wiesbaden, that's our headquarters in Germany. I have more than 15 years in experience in various positions, mostly technical, so data management, but also business development. With that being said, moving on to the agenda. So what we'll be looking at today, we're starting with some key considerations for Europe. So just a quick wrap up what Europe is about and some key information for you to consider when thinking about moving there, going there with regards to your clinical trial. Then the main topic will be set up with the need for integrated cost efficiency. We'll look at to leveraging EMA support programs, the impact on drug development cost, and the trial cost and the regional differences that we have worldwide, but also in Europe. Then clinical trials, how can you perform strategic cost management? Some examples, and then coming to an integrated strategy on how to maximize your cost efficiency if you want to go to Europe with a cost-efficient mindset. Finally, some do's and don'ts, and we'll finish up with a Q&A, so that will be around the last 20 minutes to answer your questions that you have collected during this webinar. With that being said, I'm happy to hand over to Valentina, who will start giving you an intro on the key considerations in Europe to be made.
Thank you, Philip. I'm pleased to talk today about the potential EU can offer for you if you are interested in expanding your market and entering the EU market with your pharmaceutical product or product falling under the pharmaceutical regulation. This will be the scope, of course, of our webinar today. And looking at EU, let's see and analyze how many countries are involved. So from a general perspective, there are 30 countries in the European Union, 27 European Union member states, and 3 countries which follow the European regulation. So that means that if you want to enter the European market, you will be already interested in, say, bringing the product into the market in 30 countries. And there are possibilities to do that in one go, and I will talk about that also later. But if you look at market size of the EU for drugs, then it's estimated to be about 20% of the global market. So therefore, it's I would say it's interesting market to consider. The European countries, of course, they differ in their operations and the standard of care, the languages, and additional local and specific requirements. Although they all belong to European Union, there are still differences, especially at the national phase steps and if national pathways are involved. So if you follow the, I would say, European route, that means that you would be able to register your product with the EMA, for example. So, and if you are interested in all European countries, in all 30, then there is a possibility to go through a centralized procedure, so-called CP, centralized procedure. But not all products are falling under the scope of centralized procedure. So EMA has set the scope according to which the companies can register their products centrally, and that should be reviewed to understand whether this procedure could be applied. If it's not possible to apply that, then it means that national route will need to be followed. So in this case, a decentralized procedure. And that could be done for one country or more countries in scope where the most interest lies. So as I said, the centralized procedure is not always possible, but in order to determine which type of and which route of registration in Europe is possible, you need to assess your regulatory strategy and also validate and establish the validation points with the EMA. The EMA will be the regulatory agency assessing the product and the file if you submit through the centralized procedure, and national authorities will be the authorities assessing the file if you follow national route. Of course, we shouldn't forget that, like in also other regions in Asia or in United States, you would need to have a local representative in the region you are working with. So if you are interested in expanding to the EU, you would need to have a local representative there and work with that company in order to ensure that I would say that you comply with the regulation and also that agency can approach you. So that is one of the important options. And also, if you don't want to establish your local office in the EU yet, so the EU legal representative will be required for any actions in the EU. Also, from the release perspective, from the quality perspective of your product, you would need to think about a QP, qualified person, who will need to ensure the quality complies with the standards and that can be released to European market. In the same way, it applies also to pharmacovigilance. So you would need to have the EU QPPV, so-called. Also, it's very important to emphasize that although GMP can be applied also in Asian countries, you need to follow also the EU GMP. And I know there are differences in some applications and some tiny and some, I would say, understandings of the GMP rules, but the compliance with the EU GMP rule is mandatory in the EU if you want to register your product in a European agency. And in order to sell the product, of course, it's important to have assessment of health technology. And if you follow centralized procedure, that can be nicely aligned with HTA assessments. And one, last but not least important, is that European agency and also national authorities, they charge fees for any interaction with them. So don't forget that, and that is basically should be filled in your strategy and cost-effective strategy when you plan to go to the EU. Next slide, please. So If you talk about the developing, and if you are developing a new product, it's good for you to know that there are different regulatory support programs in the EU as well. Especially when you start developing a new product and are early in the development, you could be interested in ITF meetings or an interaction with the ITF. So Innovation Task Force. At that stage, at very early stage of development, you can ask for advice from the ITF committee, and that advice is free of charge. That advice could be very valuable to validate your thinking about the development and also understand your critical points and understand how the EMEA thinks about your product and the development strategy. Of course, at different stages of your development process, you can go for scientific advice with the EMEA. The advice is not free. EMEA charges fees for any interaction with the EMEA, as I said. The fee can vary from 50,000 to 100,000 euros. Of course, if you develop a drug for a rare disease, so orphan designation, for example, it's advisable to go for orphan designation because that will give you opportunity not only to reduce the fees for the following steps, the follow-up steps, but also to get chance to get closer connections with the EMEA. If you develop products which fall under the unmet medical need, that means that you would be able to get the prime designation, which will allow you to follow the shorter and more accelerated pathways for the registration. And even conditional marketing authorization is possible because it means that you can get approval based on limited clinical data. And the last one, but not least one, is that EU offers benefits for small companies. And for example, we are EU qualified SMEs. That means that we have those benefits from the EU, and we can offer to our clients who are small companies as well. And that means that they will get up to 90% reductions of their fees. And we will go through all these steps and those programs later on, also to see how the cost reductions could be achieved at different stages. Next slide, please. So if you look at the development roadmap, so it's nothing new here that you would start with the patent application, undergo the preclinical development, and move into clinical trials and basically get the registration file complete and interact with the agency to get approval and start commercialization. So, as I said, there are the previous slide we discussed the possibilities which are given by the European Union for interaction with the agencies, and these are steps which are described here. At the bottom line, you see the possible interaction moments with the agencies. For example, ITF. Scientific advice for ODD can be done really very early at proof of concept, or even for small companies, for SMEs, at proof of principle. So that means that you don't have much data, you only have preliminary data you can share, and then you can ask for an advice how EMA looks at I would say your program and your plan and your strategy. Then, of course, when prior to starting the clinical trial, it's advisable to get a scientific advice prior to first-in-human trial, because that will give you insights, again, how the EMA looks at the way how you would need to gather clinical data. And of course, when you start your pivotal clinical trial, then it's advisable to go for alignment and confirmation of that strategy, how to get, I would say, the pivotal confirmation of your efficacy. And at the end, prior to submitting the file, it's advisable to go for a pre-submission meeting when, I would say, the content of the file will be reviewed from the perspective whether all steps are filled in and all sections which are expected to be present in the regulatory file are indeed included in the file. So that will allow you to pursue the, I would say, development with success and getting into the approval phase and basically allowing the commercialization step as well. At the last stage and later on, you also can include HTA as well into your scientific advices and have EMEA and HTA assessments and scientific advices together, so that could be reviewed not only from the perspective of the registration, but also from the perspective of commercialization and reimbursement. Next slide, please. If you look again at the development pathway and see, okay, what does it mean with respect to the cost and data we need to gather? So as you know, the development is a long process. It can take up to 15, 20 years to develop a drug. And usually out of many drugs, thousands, 10,000s of compounds you would investigate, there could be only 1 or 2 drugs which can be commercialized. So there is a lot of investment needed. And the estimate is that there's about $3.3 US needed for the R&D phase. It's excluding the clinical trial cost. And if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, you will see that clinical trial and the trials on humans to get the efficacy result and the cost of those trials is just like 50% of the entire development of the cost of the entire development of a drug, which makes it important to understand how that can be optimized so that the total cost of the development is optimized and improved. And that in that way, we still also need to understand that efficacy and the data from the clinical trial play an important role here, because at the end, even the quality, looking at the quality and safety, which are also important during the development process, the efficacy plays the most important role at the end. And that means that 50% of the budget is allocated to the clinical trials. And that's where we can look at the efficacy and how we can improve the allocation of the cost of the clinical trial. So, Philip, I pass on over to you. Oh, sorry, Palina.
Yes, thank you, Valentina. So this graph on the screen shows us quite a steep growth vector of the pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and consequently the clinical trial markets. Analytics at the online registry clinicaltrials.gov demonstrate that the number of registered clinical studies has grown twice within the last 15 years. So did the cost of clinical trials. Next, please. So in the recent past, we all have witnessed lots of mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations in our industry, which resulted in the transformation of big CROs who organize clinical trials for the clients into the giant ones. And the global market for CROs is expected to grow by 50% in the next decade. And the trend to outsource clinical studies by the study sponsors is still strong too. Next, please. So if we speak about the geography of clinical trials, there is no doubt that the US is the most interesting region in terms of marketing your product. And it explains the high interest in running clinical trials there as well. However, clinical trials in the United States are by far the most expensive. If possible, it is recommended to look at the Eastern Europe especially, because this is a direction to go, as it produces high quality clinical data acceptable by all primary regulatory agencies at the same time at a reasonable price. So I hand it over back to Valentina.
Yeah, so you see, as we said, the clinical data is crucial for regulatory file because it shows the efficacy. Of course, the drug should be safe and qualitatively acceptable, but the efficacy is the most important. And many companies fail to show efficacy, and therefore that's where many drugs have been killed. So at this stage, as I said, the clinical and efficacy data are very important, and we can look at different pathways, as we discussed in the beginning when I started, about different regulatory pathways which are offered in the European Union with registrations with limited clinical data, because it's not always possible to get the whole battery of clinical data which could be expected for all types of drugs. So you could go, as I said, for example, for a PRIME. PRIME is a regulatory support program. It's not an approval. It's just like support program giving a possibility to apply for accelerated assessment by EMA and start with early clinical and preclinical data. But of course, there will be further clinical trials needed. So you can also evaluate whether discuss with the EMA that the conditional approval is possible. Conditional approval is basically based on some preliminary clinical data. But of course, the approval will be given, but you will need to collect full battery of clinical data to show efficacy after the approval. So it's not that you will be that you will not have to collect those data. So only the timing of approval gives you a possibility to collect the data upon the approval. There are also possibilities to go for approval when collection of clinical data is not possible. The entire, I would say, execution of the entire programs is not possible, especially in the space of rare diseases and advanced therapies. So that's, and also especially if it's really unmet medical need and the rare diseases involved, because the patient group is small and you need to rely on world data and try to, I would say, to find the risk-benefit analysis based on that limited data. But that is a possibility to discuss with the EMA how to do that, because any patient is looking for the best treatment they can get, and the EMA is also interested in getting the treatments to those patients, even if the disease is really rare or extremely rare. And of course, you can get also exceptional circumstances approval. So basically, those approvals are without full clinical data. And again, it's exceptional cases, but it's possible for ultra-rare diseases, and indeed where the trials are really not possible to get the full blown data package, but at least the patients benefit from the data and the drug with the data which could be gathered. And that's where the discussion with EMA is possible for those drugs as well. Next slide, please. One of the interesting topics I want also to highlight here as well is that the development pathway, like we looked at the implications of the cost, and we looked at the implication of different interactions with the agency. But you can also look at that, for example, if you develop a drug, then that can be also in orphan drug space, so ODD, orphan drug designation. So, or it can be outside, so non-ODD space. And there is also, as I mentioned in the beginning, a possibility that the EMA gives to smaller companies, SME benefits. So that means if you look at, for example, the pathway, when you develop 3 different, or at least follow 3 different pathways in development of your product, and we look at the orphan designation, the first row, ODD. So that means that if you go for ODD submission, then you can just follow the steps. You have prepare the briefing book, get the ODD application, get ODD granted, and start the clinical trial. For the non-ODD pathway, you would also prepare the briefing book if you want to go for scientific advice, which is always advisable prior to start of the clinical trial. So regardless whether you have ODD or non-ODD, the interaction with the agency is really advised prior to the start of a clinical trial to understand how the agency approving your regulatory file will look at your program and your strategy to understand whether they have any questions and to align with their expectations, because they may have different expectations at the end than you would envisage that. So that's why the scientific advice is really important. So whether it's ODD or non-ODD, you would need to go for that. But the pathway is really similar. I also included the timeline when you're, from the start of drafting the briefing book until the, I would say, the acceptance and the start of clinical trial and scientific advice, what timeline is involved. But also what is important, most important here on this slide is that if you are a smaller company and you fall under criteria of SME, so you don't have more than 250 people on board, and your revenue is less than 50 million, approximately less than 50 million, then you would fall under the category of SME. So, and that means you would you would be able to benefit from the financial benefits EMA provides. And what does that mean? So the ODD and SMEs benefit from the benefits of the financial benefits EMA provides. So if, for example, we look at the EMA scientific advice for a normal drug not falling in the ODD space, and there is no SME advantage, then you would pay from 50 to 100,000 euros for a scientific advice. But if you have an ODD granted, then the reduction will be 75%. Approximately. And if you have the SME status but no ODD, you're developing a normal drug and you a small company, then the reduction will be 90%. And if you have both the small company and the orphan drug, then you will not pay any fee at all. So that means you'll spare 100,000 euros during development. And there are even other benefits during the entire development, especially at the registration phase and the market authorization and post-marketing and the inspection phase. I only listed the fees here which are applicable to scientific services, but just to show that there are a lot of benefits offered in European Union, and these benefits can be used by working with the European SMEs like us, because we have those SME benefits. Next slide, please.
Me, as a director of budgets and proposals at a contract research organization, I can give you a glimpse of what a clinical study budget consists of. Like Valentina highlighted, clinical trial costs comprise about 50% of the whole drug development costs, and it's important to understand a little bit better what's hidden inside those. So the budget of any clinical trial consists of two main big parts. Those are costs of CRO services or professional service fees. And the second part is pass-through costs or expenses. Pass-through, we usually use the abbreviation PTC, are all the costs that are passed directly to the sponsor by CRO at the actual expense. For example, travel, logistics, courier costs, costs of study supplies, costs of other vendors, which are subcontracted by CROs, and of course grant fees, which are to be paid to principal investigators and medical institutions for the recruitment and treatment of patients. There is a false perception that the main part of the study budget is revenue of a CRO, while in fact over 50% of costs are usually passed through that have nothing to do with CRO profit or professional service fees. We at Palleos have conducted around 400 clinical projects in the last 18 years, and based on the analysis of the budgets of our studies, we can say that on average the cost of our services comprises up to 40% of the overall study budget. I'd like to highlight also that you can see a smaller portion at the bottom, which is called other pass-through costs. Why such a big difference from 6 to 42%? Well, there are many factors, but mostly if you run in a study with a comparator, the cost of the comparator could be very, very high. So that's why this portion of the whole study budget could be really big, which should be taken into consideration. Well, this is about it, and a little bit more we speak about the clinical study budget in other webinar. I'm sure you could find it online. I encourage you to look it up. That will give you a better understanding of the clinical trial budget. Next one, please.
Thank you, Paulina. And so what I want to do as a next step is go a bit more into detail about what the levers are that you can pull if you think about going to perform clinical trials in Europe. So if you think about any project as a quick precursor, you always have time, scope, and budget. So that's the classic triangle. And you also have quality. So these are the levers that you can use to impact your clinical trial budget. So if we look at the cost drivers that are based on study design, one back, please. Based on study design, we have as first point indication and sample size. And I want to highlight on the right, with regards to pass-through cost, that institution and investigator grant fees, as you just saw, they are a big part of the budget, obviously are impacted by the location that the site will be in, right? So you can estimate that a site in Eastern Europe will be up to 50% less expensive per patient than a site that you will have in the US, or a bit less so as a site that you have maybe in Germany or France. So that is an important consideration to make in the very beginning. Which country do I want to go to? And am I aware of the consequences on the backdrop of the registration target that I have and the regulatory strategy that I have, as Valentina outlined in the very beginning? On the side of the CRO services, with regards to site management, project management, logistics support, biometrics, these are impacted by study design. So the sample size, but also the duration of the study, whether you have an adaptive design that might allow you to stop early if you meet the targets early. And as you have also seen, the number of patients and the time spent, as you see with study duration, is a big impact on the study budget. So as well, in the very beginning, starting with the end in mind, right? So what kind of clinical trial do I need to do to be able to get my registration? Talk about this in the very beginning. When you're talking to the regulatory authorities, discuss your ideas to make sure you make these decisions with awareness of the budget. And finally, the study procedures, the amount of monitoring, something to be mentioned as well. So I mentioned quality, and today we can, through risk-based monitoring and general risk-based approaches that, for example, ICA's GCP-R2, but R3 even more so, address, be clever about the amount of monitoring we apply. We can discuss that with the authorities and have a clever approach to the amount of monitoring while keeping the quality of the data the same. Next slide, please. The second point is the cost drivers that are connected to the study organization. So again, a quick note, the per patient grant fees in terms of economic factors are important. Obviously, the economic power makes a difference between Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and the US. So you will pay more for these aspects of the fees in these countries that are more expensive. So also together with the geography in the first step to be considered. In terms of CTA approval costs and study timelines, as well as the project management, site management, as well as all service costs, this is something that needs to be considered, but less so. In terms of risk and critical, sorry, go back one. The changes in the standards of therapy, changes in regulations need to be taken into account. That is not something that you can necessarily do in advance, right? So finally, the overall study timelines will be the most impactful aspect with regards to your costs. So anything that you can do with your trial design in alignment with the regulatory authorities will impact your cost in a big way. Next slide, please. So what can Palleos do in this scenario? Starting with the early strategic discussions and the definition of the study design is, I think, the most important and often overlooked aspect to do in the very beginning. So really thinking from the end in mind, what kind of clinical trial would the phase 3 have to be successful? And then working towards basically your preclinical and structure and decisions, we can, together with Starodub in terms of the regulatory strategy, help you engaging in an integrative approach with the regulatory authorities that have this cost effectiveness by design in mind. By including available email programs, you can add on to that and basically double benefit from this initial planning phase before starting into the clinical trial after all. How do we do that? So from Palleos side, we have a geographic strategy, basically configuring the country selection that you would need to do to match your registration goal, but also match your budget, right? So there's discussions to be had on how to approach this, considering the general cost levels, but also considering competing trials and programs. And finally, we also look at the study design from an operational execution perspective in the European Union. So essentially, we would come up with the study budget and design basically tailored to your approach. And I'm handing over to Valentina.
Yes, and to add what Philip said, indeed, so the strategy is the key topic. And I know many companies think we don't want to involve regulatory because it costs us money, but our advice is always to involve regulatory as early as possible to define your regulatory strategy, because at the end, it's important that you get the approval based on the efficacy data obtained through right trial design and the right patient groups. So that's very important, and that's where we can help to get indeed the strategy defined in the right way and to guide you through the pathways and possibilities to get reductions and to get the efficient budgeting in the European Union. But also advise you how to comply with other requirements like QPPV, as I mentioned, and of course be your guide in Europe. And if you are planning or not yet thinking of establishing EU representative, EU office, we would be, for example, your EU regulatory representative and legal representative, and helping you establishing the office and arranging everything according to the regulation and guide you through that. So together, indeed, we can improve your development pathway in that way that it will be first time right. Next slide, please.
So from the clinical perspectives, I want to give you some do's and one don't. As I said, it's important to align very early. And to do that with the commercial strategy in mind, to basically don't lose your goal out of sight, right? Keep your goal in mind and perform the regulatory collaboration as such. Adjust your clinical strategy with regulators, discuss it with them to have them on board, and do configure your trial location with local experts. So you're fully aware of the, advantages, disadvantages, and also the possibilities that you have when you go into one or the other location. Also, do ensure understanding clinical trial budget structure. And I want to stress again our webinar that you have on clinical trial budgets. Check our channels and you'll find it for sure. And finally, I think that's an important point. I think it's a difficult one to achieve. Do not chase financial milestones, if not for survival. I think the point here is always think about the options. it's very clear that your boundaries will not be that you have free choice. You will have to make compromises, but make these compromises as an informed decision-making process, having the EMA logic, the EMA pathways, and essentially the structure of budgets in Europe in mind. And I hand over to Valentina for her.
Yes, and indeed, as I said, like also emphasizing what Philip also explained, engaging with regulatory agencies is the really crucial step here, but also starting with target product profile and looking what do I want to achieve, what indication do I want to target, and defining regulatory strategy for that. It's a crucial point to start, and then going to the consultation with the agency and seeing that the consultation will be only beneficial to you to achieve the goal, but also ensure that you comply with the EU GXP rules. So these are GLP, GCP, and GMP rules, and that means that, for example, you can get the clinical trial done at any country, as Philip mentioned, and also as Paulina mentioned, for budgeting perspective and cost reduction perspectives, you can do trial in any country. But if you comply with the GCP criteria and do gather evidence in a representative population, then that could also add to your efficient trial design and clinical strategy and reduce your cost during the clinical evidence gathering phase. And here I also have one don't forget that even if you have all those 4 at least do's on your list, don't forget that for EU you need to have either local office or EU legal representative together with the QP and QPPV services which are specifically for Europe. Next slide, please. So if you think about key takeaways of this presentation, you can take home and just like, I hope you'll take this and you'll be able to explain to your colleagues what does it mean, the EU market. So EU market is 20% of the global market. So it's worthwhile to investigate. That the clinical trials, like we emphasize that it's 50% of your development cost, and that should be looked into detail very carefully. That there are different support programs to reduce the cost and to get interaction with the agencies to validate your programs. And I won't repeat the programs here, but they are listed here. There are programs and you can make use of those. And that early engagement with regulatory agencies is very, very advisable. That's your key to success. Next slide.
Thank you. So to bring it all together, what is an integrated cost-effective approach in the end? So if you take a look back at the drug development process, I think from our perspective, it is having in mind that you start with the end in mind. And starting with the end in mind as early as the preclinical development and taking that with you when talking to the various programs with the authorities. And Palleos and Starodub, I think, can help you here and keep you on track with these questions from the early stage on. Starodub with, taking into account the regulatory questions, covering the whole process length, and Palleos by covering the clinical side of things, which you need to take into account very early on. And so you have an integrated assistance for these questions that are not only clinical, but also regulatory and preclinical, as well as concerning the commercialization that we can help you with, but that you should think about yourselves in your organization with your people when going to Europe.
And I see lots of kind words that you send us in the chat. We are happy that you find our webinar useful. Thank you very much for your attention and for the nice words, for nice feedbacks. This is very important.
I agree. Thank you for participating, and hopefully we'll be in touch to help you to get to challenging European markets.
Thank you also from my side, and thanks for attending. I think we can close the session, and thanks everybody for attending, and hope to see you soon.